So, yeah, I'm hoping obviously you've had a chance to watch last week's recording as well, which took you through the early days of online citizen journalism, of user-generated forms of journalism that were trying to challenge the traditional legacy media, mainstream media, establishment media, whatever people might want to call them, and had some early success, but also were not ultimately particularly sustainable because of the way they had to be produced, because of the really difficult conditions that people were still working under at that point, given the very immature technologies ultimately that they were working with as well. So today we're shifting our focus to what I would call the second wave of citizen journalism, of gatewatching, of news curation, of news engagement, really, via some of the platforms that we now know and now use. So platforms like Twitter and Facebook and others, obviously, and everything else that's come along in the meantime as well. So this is really the next generation of what we're talking about here. And the focus today is on breaking news events, because that's where we've seen a lot of this happen particularly much, and these were often really the breakthrough events in many ways as well for this kind of use of these technologies in dealing with the news, engaging with and sharing the news. In the next week, then we'll deal with what happens outside of those breaking news events, what happens in day-to-day practice as people engage with the news. Because not everything, of course, is breaking news. All of us are sharing the news on our social media platforms in one form or another all the time. It's become quite habitual for us to do that, even if we're not necessarily thinking about, I'm going to share some news. I might just find a link that I find interesting and share that with my network. So that's what we'll be talking about next week, and that those two together basically provide the two sides of this story. So let's jump right in. So this is what I talked about last week. Independent media centers, the first wave, the starting points of all of this in the Battle of Seattle in the late 1990s, and everything that kind of followed on from there. The slogans: don't hate the media, be the media, become the media, set up your own media spaces, set up your own independent media spaces, independent media centers, create your own coverage of the events if you feel that the mainstream media don't report accurately about what's really going on. That's what we've come from. That's what last week's lecture covered. This is kind of where we're going. And again, I think I flashed this up briefly in one of the previous lectures. You may not recognize this as anything that you see today, but this was quite literally the first paper sketch of what would become Twitter. Still called my.stat.us, so status, back then, because it was really designed for people to just sort of update each other about, what am I doing, where am I in bed, am I going to the park, and so on. So fairly mundane sort of stuff. But this was where this started. This is Jack Dorsey, who created Twitter together with Biz Stone, kind of just mapping out, well, what would the website, what would the interface look like, basically. And as you see there is kind of just a brief, kind of a small little box there where you could enter, I guess, at that point, 140 characters about what you were currently doing. Reading, in bed, going to the park, whatever it is. And you know, the early Twitter kind of looked like that to an extent as well. It wasn't all that different from what he sketched out there. But, of course, that's not where it stayed. And we moved on much further from there to the use of this and other social media platforms. I don't want to talk only about Twitter, although it does play a particular role in much of this. But the use of Twitter and other platforms in dealing with the news as well, and particularly early on dealing with breaking news events. So this happened, for instance. I don't know if any of you, all of you remember this. It's, you know, it is 13 years ago now as well. But this was very widely acknowledged as one of the real breakthrough news events that broke first on Twitter via TwitPic, which was one of the image sharing services that we now no longer need because Twitter's incorporated a lot of this functionality into its own platform. But back then, basically, if something happened around you, the way to share this was to take a photo on your phone, upload it to TwitPic, and then tweet that link out, basically. And that's just what happened in this case. So if you don't remember this case, again, I know for some of you that might have been very much in your youth still. What happened here is that a plane that was taking off from New York ran into a flock of birds, both engines failed, and in the end, it made an emergency landing on the Hudson River just off New York, as you can see it there. And that turned into a movie later on, I think, with Tom Hanks as well, that came out maybe 5 years or a bit more ago now, about the heroics of the captain and everything else that happened afterwards. But the point of this is, it happened in one of the most mediatized cities on the planet, one of the centers for media on the planet. Many of the media houses, in fact, in the US are kind of located somewhere in Manhattan, which you kind of see a little bit there in the distance. But the first notice that this had happened came from this guy, Yanis Krums, who just happened to be on a ferry going across the Hudson River, which was diverted to pick up, the people in the plane who were clinging to rafts and standing on the fuselage and so on. So and he then tweeted this out, and that's how it became news. That's how it became known. And a lot of media organizations basically said, well, how come we didn't know about this? How come some guy on Twitter posted this, and that's how we found out about it? So that was a real breakthrough moment in the use of social media and the use of Twitter in breaking news. Although the story doesn't quite start there, actually. If we go back to some of the earlier kind of precedents for this sort of thing as well, there's this, for instance, the Christmas Day tsunami in 2004 in Indonesia. And again, some of you might remember this. I'm actually going to play a quick video here, not this one, but this one, which talks about the way that again was captured by ordinary people who had been holidaying there, rather than necessarily by media. So let me just play this video. I mean, obviously this is a Discovery Channel production, so you see that it's quite American in the way it presents this, and probably puts together a few bits of footage from Indonesia and Thailand and elsewhere. But the point stands. This is again one of those cases where it was ordinary people, citizens, first reporting about this event because they happen to be there as tourists. They happen to have their phones or camcorders or whatever else they might have had in the early 2000s out, and were recording all of this. All of the footage that you've seen, other than, of course, what they reenacted for the purpose of this video, is essentially from people's mobile phones and handheld camera recorders and so on. So that, too, was in some ways a breakthrough moment, unfortunately, for this kind of citizen recording. And we could even go back a little bit further still and think of something like this, again, as citizen reporting. This is, of course, and I'm not going to show the video, but this is a still from the famous Zapruder video that recorded the assassination of John F. Kennedy, of course, in Dallas in 1963. And that, again, that was shot, of course, as you see there, in a very grainy way at that point, with a handheld camera by someone who was just a bystander, who was just enjoying the presidential motorcade coming past and recording this for posterity, and had no idea what was going to happen, of course. So this, again, is footage that's not media footage as such. It was recorded by an ordinary person with the technology with the really cutting-edge technology, if you like, consumer technology of the time. So what we're seeing here is kind of a number of things that ultimately come together and culminate maybe in about the late 2000s in order to now put us in a space where this kind of citizen journalism, citizen recording of the news can become a lot more powerful and a lot more common as well. So we have mobile recording devices as early as the 60s. Cameras, handheld cameras, Super 8 cameras and so on to begin with, video cameras later on, camcorders, all of that, and then of course our mobile devices as well. And that starts from the 60s onwards. We have from the late 90s, early 2000s, certainly by the time that the tsunami hits, the communication networks that can carry that kind of content as well. The reason that the Zapruder film didn't really go around the world so quickly immediately was that, well, it was on film. It had to be developed first and had to be, then if you wanted to really distribute it, it had to be copied and all of that as well. You might have needed satellite networks or whatever to distribute it elsewhere. So all of that was very, very difficult. Fast forward to the early 2000s, to the tsunami, and that's all there. We've got our mobile networks. We've got the latest version at that point of the technology to record these things, and people could put the two together and upload their videos to, well, maybe the early days of YouTube or some other platform where they could already share videos in a still cumbersome and not particularly high quality kind of way. It's not the HD recording that we can do even on an iPhone these days, but certainly it was possible now to distribute this very, very quickly. And of course, distribute not just video, but photos and text updates and everything else as well very, very quickly. But it still wasn't quite so easy to really make this visible to a large audience. And that changes really with the arrival of Facebook and particularly Twitter as a really public platform where anyone who is on Twitter basically, at least in theory, has the audience of everyone else who's there if they can make themselves visible to them. So anything that you post on Twitter, unless you set your account to private, is publicly visible, is globally visible, is visible to anyone, even to people who aren't on Twitter themselves, who just get the URL for your tweet, which was the case with Yannis Krums. So this is the next kind of crucial piece in the picture, this direct means of publication, being able not just to upload things and communicate them and send them via email to your friends or whatever, but actually putting them out in public in a really easy and straightforward way where others can search for them and find them and so on. And that's what happens by the late 2000s at least. Certainly earlier as well via earlier platforms, but really fully by the late 2000s. So that's the kind of three kind of main, I guess, technological, infrastructural components that we kind of need for this kind of breaking news reporting that ordinary people can now do. There's one other factor that is also important, and that's what I'd call instant mass coordination. So not just putting these things out in the hope that someone can find them, but actually also having mechanisms to help people find them, to help others then add to this as well, to coordinate, not just to randomly put things up and for them to kind of just sit there unconnected, but to actually connect these things together as well. And one of the key mechanisms, without exaggerating, for doing that is the hashtag, is, you know, the invention, and this is why it says 2007 there, of the hashtag in its modern form for Twitter particularly. And again, that's why Twitter becomes so important, because it enables people to find each other and to coordinate their coverage and their discussion and everything else around the same topic. So for that, again, I'm just going to play you a quick video here, because I can talk about the hashtag and I can tell you where it is, but we might as well hear from the, oops, what happened there? We might as well hear from the person who actually, well, quite literally invented the hashtag. So that's Chris Messina.
My name is Chris Messina, and I am known for inventing the hashtag.
Chris Messina is a product designer who's been working in Silicon Valley for more than a decade. While running an internet consulting company in 2007, he had an idea.
There was a small group of us in San Francisco using an early social network called Twitter. And we were thinking, like, Twitter needs some kind of group organizing framework. You know, I was familiar with internet chat, and there were these chat rooms. They had a pound symbol in front of them, and I thought, you know, what if we took that idea and brought that to Twitter?
When Messina pitched the concept to Twitter, they told him it was nerdy and that it would never catch on.
I was a little bit dejected, but I left, and I thought, you know, I just don't know how else we're going to solve this problem. And so I slowly went about getting all my friends to adopt it. It took a while, but then it seems like it caught on.
In October of 2007, a friend of Chris's was tweeting about a San Diego wildfire. Chris asked him to add the hashtag San Diego Fire to his tweets. It didn't take long for others to start using the same hashtag.
What ended up happening was that got recorded and reported on by Wired. The fact that that happened like the first time we tried it gave me a good sense that this could actually work.
The idea caught on, and 2 years later, Twitter added an option to search for hashtags.
It turned out that lots of people wanted to have their voices heard, and they wanted to participate in a global conversation.
Hashtags are now used by millions across all social media platforms. When Instagram launched in 2010, users would tag photos with hashtags like #NoFilter or YOLO. Facebook would adopt them in 2013. These days, you see hashtags everywhere, on billboards, TV shows. People even use them in everyday conversations.
I brought you some cookies. Hashtag homemade, hashtag oatmeal raisin, hashtag show me the cookie.
Sweet. Hashtag don't mind if I don't.
The hashtag even had incredible influence on the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
And we will make America great again.
One of the ways that I think people have adopted hashtags is to essentially express things that you would do through little sleights of hand or sort of speaking out of the side of your mouth. A lot of people will use, hashtag blessed in sentence form, for example, to sort of provide a humble brag.
While some users simply want to brag on Instagram, others are using the versatile tool for change. It's what some media outlets are calling hashtag activism. Movements like Never Again, Me Too, and Black Lives Matter have gained incredible momentum thanks to their hashtags. Chris never made a dime off the hashtag idea.
I didn't create this idea for Twitter. I created this idea for the internet. And I wanted anybody who could write text on the internet to be able to participate in global conversations. The way in which hashtags can distill a feeling or a sentiment and essentially kind of put up like a social bat signal that says this is what this is about, and people can say, yes, I agree with that, or no, I don't, gives, I think, a lot more people the ability to participate in a way that didn't exist before.
All right, so that's Chris Messina, and that's the hashtag. I mean, imagine being the person who invented the hashtag. It's a kind of a weird claim to be able to make, but it's genuinely true, and it's genuinely, of course, an important device in good ways as well as bad, as we've seen from some of the examples that have happened there. And I want to be clear, not every hashtag, of course, links to a breaking news event. Not every hashtag has anything to do with news. Again, as he says, the hashtag blessed or humble brag or whatever has nothing to do with news. But in so many cases, particularly when there are breaking news events, there will be a hashtag that emerges very, very quickly to coordinate essentially the discussion about what these events are, what's going on there. And yeah, this is his original message, literally from August 2007, to say, well, what about this? How about a hashtag? Well, we use that. Of course, it didn't look like that back then. This is a recent screenshot. Twitter looked very different back then. But that's how it started. And even in the meantime, it's only had about 4,500 retweets, which is, for something that was so momentous and so fundamentally changed the platform, is actually quite surprising, I think. So yeah, I've talked about this, and ultimately, it's true that news now breaks on Twitter in part because of the hashtag, because it provides the mechanism for highlighting that something's going on. And of course, yes, when he created this and when people first picked it up, there wasn't such a thing as searching for hashtags specifically, but you could search for, the hashtag, word, so #SanDiegoFire, and find all the tweets related to it. That was possible. Twitter has now built in a lot more functionality where you can just click directly on the hashtag, you see all the latest tweets or all the top tweets from the hashtag. So Twitter's recognized eventually, after first dismissing it as being too nerdy, they've recognized now eventually that this was an important mechanism for coordinating activity on the platform, and they've made it easier for users to use that mechanism as well. So why Twitter, though, in all of this? I've said a lot about Twitter. Well, again, part of it is because almost all of the accounts on Twitter are public. And that makes a real difference. It's a lot easier to find information on a platform that is public by default. It's not so easy to do this on Facebook, where a lot of stuff happens in people's personal profiles and elsewhere that you can't quite so easily find. on a really fundamentally public platform, that's a lot easier. It's easy to post. I mean, they're short messages, of course, 140 characters originally, 280 now. So it's not like you have to write a long kind of message, a long blog post or anything. You can just write a quick update. Originally, the idea was even, and that's why they are this short, that you could just send an SMS to a number somewhere and that would then be turned into a tweet. Now, of course, you can add images and videos, which adds more functionality and adds more possibilities for sharing your content as well in this way. And, of course, posting images of planes landing on the Hudson River and whatever else there is. So that adds even more power and more functionality to this as well. And again, the publicness doesn't just extend to people who are users of Twitter, but a public tweet is visible to anyone on the internet, to anyone on the web. So you can go to any URL for a tweet and see it, as long as it's public, without even needing a Twitter account. And that means also, of course, that news sites can embed tweets into their coverage, can take screenshots and so on without needing to be friends with the person who posted it or any other kind of permission, essentially. And that, again, speeds up the distribution of content even further. Twitter also, again, different from Facebook and other platforms, you can kind of follow anyone. You can follow Barack Obama and Joe Biden if you want to, and you can follow celebrities and everyone else without them having to approve you as a friend, as a follower, without them having to follow you back either. So that, again, makes the connections between users a lot easier, a lot quicker. And if you find, for instance, as a journalist, that someone's posting suddenly updates about this plane on the river, well, you can follow that person and see if they're posting any more, and you'll see all of that coming into your feed very quickly as well. So that's, again, a particular feature of Twitter. And then, again, with the hashtags being added and with the search functions being extended to enable the tracking of hashtags more easily, that adds more functionality still. And of course, then not just search, but trending topics as well. And that, again, highlights particular hashtags that rise to the top in terms of activity and alert even more people to them as well. And that ultimately allows what I'd call ad hoc publics to just form very quickly, around these hashtags, around these topics, and to coordinate what they're doing, to post updates from different areas that are affected by the fire, let's say, to post more pictures and more updates from what's happening with this plane on the river, and so on. And so what happens then, of course, as they're all doing that, is that others who may not be directly on the scene but are following this can also retweet it and share it on and comment and ask what they can do to help and so on. And all of that activity around the kind of core group of people who are posting about what's really going on the ground, it further increases the visibility of all of this content. It spreads those messages even further by retweeting to new networks on Twitter. And of course, trending topics pick up on this again as well. And so this is really another form of gatewatching. This is another form of looking at, well, what's going on Twitter? And that's the gatewatching part. And then selecting from that what I want to share with my own followers, with my own audiences. And that's the news curation part as well. So that, again, is happening, of course, here for, as a sort of a secondary part after people are posting these updates on their own accounts. And again, I've said this already, trending topics algorithms, of course, then also pick up on that and make it further visible, show it in the list of trending topics, push it into your news feeds and so on. So that's actually not human gatewatching and news curation, but algorithmic gatewatching and news curation. They're basically doing what ordinary users might be doing as well, which is to pick up on the signals of what seems to be being talked about a lot and retweeting it. And in this case, the algorithms are doing much the same thing, picking up on what everyone on Twitter is talking about and what seems to be rising in prominence very quickly, and then making that even more prominent by putting it on the trending topics list and so on. So that's the algorithmic part of gatewatching and news curation in this case. So what's that lead to? Well, this is the original case that they talked about in that video as well. This is the San Diego fire, or an excerpt at least of the San Diego fire discussion in 2007. Again, it wouldn't have looked like this obviously in 2007 because the user interface of Twitter looked very different, but you can see how they're all kind of putting up new updates. They're on sharing also to some extent what they see in the media. There's a few kind of references saying, well, CBS has reported this. There's some people saying, keep it coming, call some number, not sure why that number. Maybe that's a journalist who's actually sourcing information from social media in this case, from Twitter as well, and saying, you citizen journalists are most important now. Big media coverage is scarce. And then you've got someone else who's actually posted something probably on their blog about the latest updates and is sharing a link to that as well, by the way. So there's all of that going on, and that's really a community coming together to coordinate, well, what the hell's going on? How do we make sense of this? How bad is it? And so on. And that's become more and more common because obviously as the user base for Twitter and for other social media platforms has increased, kind of whatever happens in the world, there's usually someone already there who will be covering this as well. For instance, this guy, Sohaib Athar, who is talking there about, a helicopter hovering above Abbottabad at 1 a.m. in Pakistan. And it says, well, go away, helicopter, before I take out my giant spotter and swat you away. And then, oh, wow, a huge window-shaking bang here in Abbottabad. I hope it's not the start of something nasty. Now, you may already know what this is about. And he found out sometime later, 40 minutes later or so, oh, I'm now the guy who live blogged the Osama bin Laden raid in Pakistan without knowing it. So he happened to just be on the scene somewhere near the compound where Osama bin Laden was hiding. He was reporting about these, military events going on, helicopters and explosions and everything. He had no idea, of course, what was going on. And then he saw the news saying, oh, Osama bin Laden has been killed in Abbottabad in Pakistan. And he put the two together and said, oh, wow, that's what that was. So even without knowing it, he reported a major world event, from somewhere where perhaps you would not expect there to be all that many Twitter users at the time. But clearly he was there and others were there as well. So we're now getting to a point where really anything that happens in the world almost, there's going to be someone there who's reporting about this. And this was 2011, and it's probably even more true now, of course. And of course, it's no longer just ordinary people, but you've got, these sorts of things happening as well. Barack Obama posting something when he gets re-elected, and this is of course a prepared post. So I'm cheating a little bit here by saying this is not citizen journalism, but it is again the use of these platforms for essentially posting something which ultimately is kind of still a breaking news story, saying, hey, I've been re-elected, isn't it wonderful? Or this. This is, not quite citizen journalism, but if you've got two players of a football team that's just won the World Cup actually tweeting an image from the ground at the time, minutes after they've won the World Cup, it's still quite different from just the standard media coverage, right? So even you could call Lukas Podolski and Bastian Schweinsteiger citizen journalists for that moment perhaps as well, but they're obviously involved in the event as well. They're not just bystanders. So that's the sort of, the range of things that this is now being used for. And of course, then it becomes kind of built into new events much more from the start as well. It's not just a reaction anymore to what's going on in the world, but we're seeing it actually being utilized right from the start in things like, the so-called Twitter revolution or social media revolution in the Arab Spring, for instance, in the 2010s to 2012s. Just look at that picture. And, this is obviously a sign someone's holding up at Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011, I think it is. But they've gone to the trouble of painting the Facebook logo on that sign and the hashtag Jan25 for the day of protest. And of course, they're saying, this is the Egyptian social network, basically. So they're in a sense appealing both to a Facebook and a Twitter audience in protesting against the Egyptian regime as part of the Arab Spring. So now these platforms are seen not just by the outside, but by people who are actually there on the ground involved in the protest at the time as a critical tool in both reporting about what's going on, but also, of course, in the activism that's involved in actually leading these protests in the first place. So more and more these platforms are now very, very directly embedded in both a journalistic and an activist kind of sense in these events. And what's interesting here too, and so we did some work on this back in the day and looked at, for instance, the hashtag Egypt, which was quite widely used to cover the events going on. And we kind of looked there to look for Arabic and non-Arabic content in these hashtags as well. What was interesting was that early on, most of the content of the hashtag Egypt was not in Arabic, which really largely means was in English, to a lesser extent in French and German and other languages as well. So as the people on the ground, as well as the Egyptian diaspora around the world, as well as others who were interested, were using Twitter to talk about these protests, to talk about the Egyptian part of the Arab Spring, they were largely doing so actually in English and other global languages in order to connect with a global audience and seek their support, seek the support of foreign governments, of course, seek the support of the general global public as well, rather than just coordinating amongst themselves in Arabic. And that was quite a deliberate strategy as well. So rather than just covering the events and the news and engaging in activism in their own language, which would have been just for a domestic audience, they were quite deliberately now choosing to do this for a global audience. You see, I think, an echo of that also if you're looking now, today, really, these weeks, at the global coverage, the discussion, the activism around the protests in Iran, for instance, that are going on right now after the death of Mahsa Amini. So that, again, is also appealing to a global audience, connecting with not just the Iranian, or in this case, Egyptian diaspora around the world, but really connecting with the global public as well. But as things moved on, that shifted very significantly. As sort of global attention moved on, a lot more of the longer-term activity in that hashtag was in Arabic because, and because in some ways, of course, the Arab Spring failed in Egypt, it has to be said, and produced just different types of oppressive governments. The use of this hashtag and the use of Twitter and Facebook overall in Egypt became a matter of more longer-term activism rather than still trying to connect that much with the global English language public. So again, not all hashtags are successful, of course. Not all hashtags are going to lead to lasting change. And in a sense, the immediate citizen journalism reporting phase that you saw early on in 2011 kind of went away, and it moved much more to an activist use of the hashtag as well. And that's important to keep in mind as well. Not all of these are purely for citizen journalism and reporting, of course. And again, I've shown this picture before, Andy Carvin from National Public Radio, NPR in the US, who was one of the key people who were picking up on all of this content, all of this material being posted online, being posted on Twitter, as you see there on his many feeds and many streams there that he's got open of Egyptian and other activists and people posting updates in various hashtags and so on. So he was following all of that stuff and then using that as input into his own reporting, but also curating this into a news feed on Twitter, again, in itself, for his own followers. And that's kind of how Western journalists, if they were smart, were actually picking up on all of this content coming out of Egypt via Facebook, via Twitter, via other platforms as well. So in that sense, again, this is kind of journalists now piggybacking onto this, and the social media that we're seeing being used there are really used as citizen media in a new way beyond what we saw last week. They become, and that's still true, I think, in both the first and the second wave, a vital source of real-time citizen news during these sorts of crises, as Stuart Allen has said. And Jeff Jarvis, as he is wont to do, goes further even and says the witnesses are taking over the news. So that's really saying, well, it's actually kind of the people on the ground who are now writing the news stories, and people like Carvin are just picking up on that, putting it all together in a single report. And particularly when stuff's happening that's unexpected, new crisis, new events, this really serves as a new seismograph for current and surprising events. Detecting earthquakes, detecting tremors is really the metaphor here, and I'll get back to that in a second. And journalists are starting to realize that. Emily Bell says there's journalism before Twitter and journalism after Twitter. This is a massive, change that's going on here. It makes a big difference that suddenly having all these four components that I talked about before, recording devices, distribution infrastructure, the platform itself through which you can post this, and the hashtag as a coordinating mechanism, having all of that now put together in the late 2000s, that fundamentally changes how journalism works, or at least can work as well. And Alfred Hermida talks about this as social awareness streams. You can follow, your Twitter feed. It doesn't need to be from journalists. It can be from anyone in your network, but you become aware of what's going on in the world through that. Depending on who you follow, of course, you might focus on some topics more than others, but by following that, you get all of this stuff now coming through your network, and you become aware, at least peripherally aware, of what's going on. And because it's not controlled either by professional journalists, who are, these platforms, they're not journalistic platforms, they're not run by media companies, so it's not controlled by professional journalists. And it's not controlled either by the citizen journalists who might be there and the ordinary people who are there either. It's controlled by Facebook and Twitter and the other platform providers. It's a kind of, for both of them, it's not their medium. It's a common medium in which they kind of come together, but neither of them control it. And that's actually quite important as well. And by, again, retweeting, engaging, and so on, and by the algorithms picking up on all of these processes as well, that, as Sharon Mraz and Zizi Papakarisi say, is crowdsourcing the key actors and their tweets to prominence. The more something gets retweeted, the more visible it becomes. But the retweeting is what ordinary people are doing. So any and all of them put together are deciding what becomes visible, what becomes prominent. And that's a crowdsourcing process, ultimately. It's a crowd-driven process. It's not necessarily the journalists doing it, although they, of course, might also be involved in the retweeting and the sharing and the liking and so on. And I said something about the seismograph before, and that's not just a metaphor. This is quite literally an interface that the US Geological Survey has designed for itself, which uses Twitter, and by now probably other social media platforms as well, to detect earthquakes. Because when earthquakes happen, people will say, oh, wow, I just felt an earthquake. So if you follow the term earthquake or whatever else they've got there, terremoto, temblor, deprem, gempa, earthquake, and so on, if you follow these and other relevant terms, and you suddenly see a big spike, as you see there on the graph at the top, you suddenly see a big spike in activity going on, well, that probably means there's an earthquake, People might be talking about, tremors or whatever in other ways as well, but if all of this comes together, that probably actually means people in wherever they are have just felt an earthquake. And if you can kind of work out where they are from their profile descriptions or geolocations or whatever else, then of course you can actually work out perhaps where that earthquake is as well. And in fact, there's a kind of a weird thing there. Earthquakes themselves are essentially sound waves through Earth, right? So that's, without getting into geology here, but that's essentially what an earthquake is. Sound waves through Earth don't travel very quickly. Tweets are electronic impulses through social networks, through wired and wireless networks, and they travel at the speed of light. So the tweets actually arrive at the seismograph or at the Seismological Institute sometimes before the sound waves through Earth arrive. So they can actually, to an extent, detect earthquakes more quickly from Twitter than they can from their own seismographs. Probably just by a matter of seconds or minutes, but still, that's the power of this kind of tool as well, to detect these things if you're tracking it. if you're tracking them, to detect them very, very quickly and be able to I guess, prepare a little bit more for them. So, in fact, this isn't just, I don't know if you noticed yourselves, but there was actually an earthquake in Zurich about a month ago. Well, not in Zurich so much as in southeastern France, I think near Mulhouse somewhere, but we could feel it here if you were in the right place. And so this actually happened to me, and I posted that on Twitter, and yes, other people did as well, as you could see there. I don't know who these people are, Markus Lisser, I don't know him, but he posted something saying, well, did someone feel an earthquake in Zurich? And yes, I felt it too, and the Seismological Service, obviously, of Switzerland also posted it out. And there were a whole lot of other people who were responding to this as well, saying, yes, I felt it, no, I didn't. And I felt it in Ulm, and I felt it elsewhere as well. So this is not, the example I just talked about with the US Geological Service, this is not something that just happens somewhere else. That happens here as well, basically. So that, just as an aside. So I've talked about the sort of the formation of ad hoc communities around this sort of stuff already, and let's get a little bit more into that discussion as well. Again, speaking of crises, speaking of disasters, this is the place where I'm usually based, Brisbane, in 2011, when we had some very significant flooding across town. You see there at the bottom of that screen, of that picture, houses flooded basically to their roofs near the river. And that occurred in really quite a few areas of the city. 2011, of course, was a time when social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook, were already very widely adopted in Australia and elsewhere. So, of course, people also started to use social media to engage with this, to talk about this, to cover the floods, to talk about what happened, how bad it was, and so on. We did some analysis of this. What we looked at here is what exactly it is that they did, to how they talked about it, what they talked about. And this is kind of, in a very kind of poor graph, but this is kind of the overview of what it is that they talked about. They talked about what we call situational information, which is basically reporting from the ground, saying, my street's flooded, or it's just at the bottom of the steps right now, and it's coming up, and so on. So really reporting about, well, how far has it gone? What areas of the city are affected? Of course, you didn't have enough news crews to cover everything. You had police busy with other more urgent things. So this provided a really strong situational report from all over town about where the flooding was, what areas were affected, and so on. They posted multimedia, of course, so images, videos from on the ground to document how things were looking at their place. They shared advice on how to, board up your windows and your doors, how to place sandbags and all that kind of stuff as well. They were already starting to engage in fundraising as well, so helping to, setting up donation drives and whatever else to help. They were sharing news media content, they were asking for help, and a lot of other things that you see there as well. But so this is not a random kind of discussion. This is not just people saying, oh, how horrible it is, pray for Brisbane. But these are people who are genuinely engaged in sharing the latest information, who are acting essentially as citizen journalists, as community organizers, in support roles, or even just as gatewatchers amplifying the latest content as well. So that's what we're seeing. What we were seeing there in, by the way, the hashtag QLD floods for Queensland floods, which emerged very quickly, again, was crowdsourced to prominence by, if you want to use the language that Miraz and Papakarisa used, crowdsourced to prominence by other Twitter users. So that's what happened in that particular hashtag at the time. And then we saw, in fact, the same year, unfortunately, we saw the same again with the major earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand, which looked like this and caused substantial loss of life and obviously damage to property, as you can clearly see there. And there too, we looked at there the hashtag EQNZ, Earthquake New Zealand, which emerged again very quickly as the hashtag to follow. And what we looked at here is just, well, who's actually getting the most attention from ordinary users as well? Who is getting retweeted, or in this case, replied to, And what we saw there very clearly was there were mainstream news sources that were providing good coverage, the New Zealand Herald, NZ Stuff, the TVNZ News and others. You saw authorities that were being responded to. The Christchurch earthquake organization that was set up by the government of New Zealand, the Christchurch City Council and others, and utility providers as well, particularly mobile phone companies that were providing updates on where there was coverage and where there wasn't because of damage to infrastructure. So this is again this idea of crowdsourcing particular actors, particular participants to prominence. In this case, it was essentially saying these are the key kind of sources of information, of updates, of news, official sources that you should connect with, that you should follow as well. So it wasn't, again, just random people emerging, but some of these authorities also ended up participating very actively and very constructively in the Twitter hashtag, in the Twitter debate that unfolded after these earthquakes. And then more recently, we've seen the same again. I mean, unfortunately, there's been plenty of cases, of course, that I could be talking about here. We did some work looking at the Paris and Brussels terrorist attacks in 2015, 2016 as well. And here again, you've got an example of a kind of a direct report of the attacks that happened in 2016 at Brussels airport. In this case, actually, and that's interesting in its own right as well, by someone who is a journalist who just happened to be on the scene at the time, taking this video on her mobile phone. So even professional journalists are now engaging, in a sense, as citizen journalists on these platforms as well. The boundary between citizen journalism, professional journalism in that sense, certainly in the context of crisis events, of these sorts of acute events, is very much breaking down. This person was just happened to be there at the time and was sharing the information immediately after it happened. And again, to the other side of the coin is that we see these more emotional and supportive responses, of course, that are starting to happen as well. In this case, again, by Le Monde, by the French newspaper, showing sympathy between France and Belgium in this case. But, so this is also the move from the current event, the acute event, the crisis event, also to a much broader discussion, a much broader kind of expression of sentiment around these events that we see repeated now with everything again that's happening in the world. We're seeing this right now, for instance, with the Ukraine war, where we have both the reporting directly from on the ground that's going on, of course, as well as people expressing their sympathies and their support for Ukraine and organizing fundraising and organizing activities and protests and everything else as well. So that's now a very common occurrence, of course, with anything and everything that happens in the world. You'll see these hashtags emerge, you'll see people coming together on Twitter and other platforms to talk about what's going on and to share information as well as to provide support and will ask what kind of support is actually necessary as well. In fact, this is Twitter's own analysis from just a couple of years ago when the Black Lives Matter protests really took off, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and various others. Twitter here says that in 2020 there were 390 million tweets about Black Lives Matter, not just, I think, containing the hashtag BLM or Black Lives Matter, but a few other terms as well. But that's the kind of volume of response now that's starting to happen. So 390 million tweets just since the 25th of May that year, which I think was might have been the day when George Floyd was killed. So that's the level of use of a platform like that. Now, of course, not all of this is by actual citizen journalists on the ground reporting on what's going on, but it's also by people who are marching, and that's another form of citizen journalism reporting, I guess, as well, in protests in the US and around the world, and by people simply expressing, again, their support, their sympathy, or retweeting, or reposting, or resharing. And of course, also some people responding in a negative way to this. So that's the kind of volume. And in fact, and this is not a great graph, but the point of it is the yellow bars indicate the percentage of the total volume of US Twitter that was talking about Black Lives Matter at this time. And as you see there on the 2nd of June, that was probably about a third of all the tweets that day were about Black Lives Matter. So that's how central a platform like Twitter can become to this kind of debate, and how much a debate like this can actually take over a platform like that as well. That's the kind of the strength and the volume of the response that we see to these kinds of breaking news topics. We could certainly look at this for other major breaking news topics in much the same way as well. And that's the power, in a sense, of these platforms, of this infrastructure, of this technology. But really, it's not just the technology, it's how we use it. So of our uses of these tools in response to breaking news events now, and of course, ongoing crises and ongoing debates as well. But, of course, that's not quite the only part of the story. We're also seeing this sort of stuff. Now, before anyone gets confused, just to point out, this is from 2016. She is now dead. She wasn't then. Although, of course, on social media, there were rumors at that point circulating. And again, more recently, we've had occasions, every once in a while, when there are rumors that the Queen was dying and all of that. So this, and it kind of almost looks like a hostage photo there, I think, just a proof of life or something. But, this also, of course, happens now on social media. Rumors start swirling around that something has happened, even when perhaps it hasn't or hadn't. And people might believe them, people might engage with them. And that's really what broadly now we're calling fake news, although that's a deeply problematic term for reasons I'll go into in a couple of weeks' time. But it's rumors, it's misinformation, it's disinformation. It's sometimes very much deliberate spreading of disinformation, of course, as well, in order to confuse people, to perhaps make them vote for something that they wouldn't otherwise vote for, to make them spend money on something they wouldn't otherwise spend money on. So whether it's for political or commercial reasons or something else, there is a lot of mis- and disinformation now swirling around on social media as well. And again, also particularly in the context of breaking news events, when generally people aren't sure what the hell's going on and might be led to believe these kinds of false news stories because they just don't know any better. The same happened a few years earlier than that, 2013, when you might remember there was a bombing at the Boston Marathon, and there was a national manhunt really that started immediately after that. And the Boston police, for instance, put out this kind of image saying, "We think this is one of the bombers. Does anyone know who this person is? Can anyone identify them?" So that's using social media essentially for crowdsourcing information, for seeking information from the general public, which in itself is perfectly legitimate and perfectly appropriate. But what happened then, and this is not Twitter but Reddit, but it happened on Twitter just as much, you started to see subreddits, in this case, like Find Boston Bombers pop up, where people were basically wildly speculating on the identity of this person, posting there, as you see, all sorts of images of others, like there's the guy there, four down, who may or may not be the same person as the actual bomber that the Boston police posted out. And we ended up with people engaging in essentially kind of a crowdsourced citizen manhunt of people who had nothing to do with the bombing. People were misidentified as being these bombers. People were being raided, SWAT teams were called to their houses and so on, just because they had some kind of passing resemblance maybe with that bomber, or maybe just someone had it in for them and just said to the police, "I think my neighbor is the bomber," and so police arrived there with sirens blazing. So that's also part of the problem, of course, that when these things happen and people are genuinely uncertain about what's going on, they might also jump to conclusions and they might attack the wrong people and say, well, it's that person or this person. And maybe, of course, they might just be doing that because their neighbor happens to be from another country and they don't like him much, and so it's purely driven by racism or xenophobia as well. So these sorts of things, of course, are very much also happening now as a result of the use of social media for these kinds of purposes. And that's something, again, in 2 weeks' time I'll talk a bit more about when we get to this whole question of mis and disinformation and how it spreads on social media. But so what do the journalists do with all of that then? Because again, they're also exposed to this mis and disinformation. They also have that trouble of deciding what's true and what isn't. And so again, we have this kind of gatewatching and news curation process that's driven in the first place by the vast majority of users in a sense. And again, Zizi Papakrisi and De Fatma Oliveira are talking about this as a user-generated collaborative argument on what is news. So it's really the users, as you kind of saw with that Reddit screenshot as well, basically arguing over, well, who are the Boston bombers? Are these accurate pictures or not? So this is an argument basically over what's the truth, ultimately, what is news. And in essentially also applying maybe different sets of news values to this content, saying, well, you know, there maybe we still agree to some extent on what's news, but we might make different decisions on a particular topic, on a particular issue, whether it is all that newsworthy or not, whether it deserves media attention or not. And users might push some stories to greater visibility that journalists had not picked up on, for instance. And journalists might report about things that users find actually not that important. And from that process on social media, at least, you see kind of leaders emerge ultimately as well, because of the work of the communities themselves. Some people just become more and more visible because of that. They may be the right leaders, they may be people who actually know something about what's going on the ground in an event, or they might just be people who spin a great story and who post disinformation, but post very convincing disinformation, and they become seen as the leaders of this story. So again, that could be a double-edged sword that's happening here as well. Again, and this is probably one of the last times I'll talk about Andy Carvin, I think, but he says his Twitter network at the time of the Arab Spring were his editors, his researchers, his fact-checkers, his newsroom, and he said, well, his work is another flavor of journalism, and he's another flavor of journalist. So really, he's using this source material, and he clearly feels that he also has the ability to sort reality from falsehood, to identify when someone is trying to tell him something that's not true, versus having the real information. And he did very well during the Arab Spring, but of course, by now the people who are trying to disinform have also got a lot better at their job and are able to create much more convincing fakes, essentially, as well, including deep fakes. So journalists have to come to terms with how they operate in these sorts of acute events in social media as well. One of the things that happens is that they're being identified themselves as news actors. They're not just working for a news outlet writing stories. They're not just hiding behind the name of the news outlet that they're working for, but they're now directly involved as well. People can talk back to them and say, hey, this is not the full story, here's some more information. People can engage with them and speak to them and so on, and criticize them as well, of course, and say to them, well, you're not getting this right, here's the real story. And so that changes the hierarchy. Journalists are no longer kind of separate from the general public, and the general public are no longer just an audience, but they have their own voices in these spaces as well. And there is therefore also a greater diversity of voice. It's not just journalists who get to talk about an event and say, this is what's going on, but you've got people on the ground, you've got people at a distance who might have some knowledge about this, who are also getting involved and are having much more of a debate about what's really going on. And that means that different ways of framing an issue, of understanding an issue or a topic or an event might also emerge from the community. And that's kind of almost going back to what I said a couple of weeks ago, or last week when I talked about indie media, because indie media was very explicitly set up to provide a different frame on the World Trade Organization meetings. Rather than just saying, well, this is great and we need more globalization, indie media was set up to say, well, hang on a minute, what are the pros and cons here? And in the media was also set up to say, well, these people on the streets who are protesting against this are not rioters, they are activists, and they have a different point of view that needs to be properly represented. They can't just be written off as rabble and rioters and people who are just troublemakers, basically. So this is a battle over how to frame these events appropriately, how to understand and how to report about them appropriately as well. And so, yeah, these alternative perspectives might argue with, might correct, might go up against the journalistic reporting, and that's now becoming an open competition because they're both occurring on the same platform, on Twitter, on Facebook, on other social media platforms. They're both occurring in these spaces, and you know, they might be almost equally visible at times. So journalistic content doesn't automatically have greater visibility in these spaces. And of course, that then, as journalists are realizing that, and as they're maybe taking on board some of these corrections and some of these alternative views, that might affect how they start to report about all of this as well. You know, they might start to respond and say, well, actually, you know, there is another view out there. There are other perspectives out there. Maybe I'll start to incorporate those into my reporting a bit more. So, and sorry, there's a few really long words in there, but in some ways, particularly in the context of breaking news, what's happening here is, in the first place, disintermediation. And that means essentially intermediaries are taken out of the process. In earlier times, when something happened in the world, you needed journalists as intermediaries to take the original reports, process them into stories, and put them out in newspapers, in news broadcasts, and so on, and thereby allow them to reach audiences. Now, that's no longer the case, because people who are on the ground can directly report about what's going on and reach their audiences directly. You don't necessarily need the journalist as intermediary anymore because of all of the infrastructural and behavioral changes that happened with the advent of social media. But of course, that also means there's re-intermediation, that these citizen journalists, these new people who are reporting, and in fact the platforms themselves that provide the infrastructure for doing all of that, are inserting themselves or being inserted as new forms of intermediaries as well. If you're just on the ground and you're seeing a plane land on the Hudson River, that's not going to, if you're talking about that just by yourself, that's not going to reach anyone. You still need the platform, you still need all of that in between you and your prospective audience for it to actually reach that audience. So there are new intermediaries, and that's re-intermediation. So journalists being, if not completely taken out, being reduced as intermediaries, and new platforms, new operators, new stakeholders emerging as intermediaries. And that could, of course, also again include those journalists who are now starting to use social media to actually report about what's going on as well. So disintermediation, but also then re-intermediation again. I hope that makes sense. And then, of course, that might also create conflict between the people who are being sidelined to an extent, the traditional news journalists and news outlets, of course, themselves as well, and the new intermediaries that are emerging, the platforms and the citizen journalists. So between those now, there might be some conflict about, well, you know, what roles should we have? Who should get to talk about what's going on in the world? Who can you trust? Who can you rely on? Who's providing the right, the accurate, the best informed, the most objective coverage about what's going on in the world? And that's the conflict that's starting to emerge from this really substantial change. And in a few weeks' time, when I talk about the journalistic response to all of this, both at the level of the individual journalist and at the level of the news outlet, I'll go into much more detail about how that conflict ended up playing out. And you know, one way I kind of think about this is, in the English literature, journalism is often described as a first rough draft of history. So journalists don't write history as such. They're writing kind of a first version of history as they're documenting what happened today and yesterday and last week and so on. You know, as tonight, you know, they're publishing a news story that is about what happened today. That's the first rough draft of history. Historians will then take that and turn it into a much more complete version of history by taking all the other sources into account. But that's what journalism is seen to be doing, a first draft of history. Now, Twitter and other social media platforms still work a lot more quickly than that. So in some ways, Twitter is more like a first draft of the present, of what's currently happening, what's happening right now, before it even becomes any kind of history. It's someone taking a snap of the plane on the Hudson River, someone posting about the raids in Abbottabad without really knowing what's going on, but already putting that out there for other people to see. And then only after some time we find out, oh, okay, so that's an emergency landing, or we find out, oh, okay, so that was the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. So that's what I mean by a first draft of the present. Before it even becomes history, it's kind of a first snapshot of, this is happening right now. We don't really know what it means, but this is happening right now. And then perhaps it feeds into the journalistic process that turns this into a first draft of history, or it feeds into longer-term historical process that creates a full history of that particular time and that particular event. So that's what I mean by first draft of the present. And that's kind of echoed in a sense by what Jeff Jarvis says here, who says, such will be our new view of the news. Urgent, live, direct, emotional, personal, because we're all kind of reporting the news in a sense whenever we post an update about what's going on in the world around us. And it's kind of live, it's kind of urgent, it's very personal and direct and emotional as well. We're not journalists as such, and so we're not necessarily following the journalistic traditions of kind of a detached and objective kind of view of the world. Someone might just say, oh wow, something's happening around me, there's helicopters and explosions, I don't know what it is, but it's sure is big. And that's the sort of urgent, live, direct, emotional, personal response. And then someone else will say, oh, by the way, you just heard the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. So that's the shift that's happening here, for good as well as bad. Because again, as we've seen with the Boston Marathon manhunt, that emotion can, of course, take over as well and can lead to all sorts of problematic activities, behavior, responses. That liveness, that urgency, that directness can also mean that people are misunderstanding what they're seeing around themselves and are misreporting it, even with the best of intentions, that they just say, well, I just saw this happen, I think this is what it is. And others take that as at face value, and maybe it isn't actually what it is, and maybe they got that wrong, and maybe that creates a big sort of response from others that's actually inaccurate and misunderstands what's really happening in the world. So this is not in any way unproblematic, but this is what's happening. And I think if you're looking around yourselves, if you're looking around the sort of thing at the things that you see in your own social media feeds as well, you'll see a lot of this sort of very instant response to what's going on as well in those feeds. Okay, so that takes us to the end of this week's lecture. Now, just next time, again, I'm going to shift away from this idea of the random, the kind of the breaking news, the acute events, the kind of the key moments when social media really show that they're being used to cover the news, to engage in the news, to debate the news and all of that. And I'll shift much more to the everyday kind of way in which we engage with news via social media. The random acts of gatewatching, the everyday news sharing practices. And for that, please read that fourth chapter of the book, which covers that aspect as well. So thank you all, and see you then.